So I want to briefly scan over this story, really, my story of examining child abuse in the Catholic Church. So I'm going to go through that fairly swiftly because I know the theme of the conference is power. So I want to kind of land on power and talk a bit about what I felt was the paradox of power and powerlessness that was important in this problem in the Catholic Church in child sexual abuse. I want to talk about how I adopted Beck's notion of organized irresponsibility for a couple of chapters in my book on the topic. And then I want to talk a little bit about moral responsibility and finish with a thought on justice. So many of you will know this book. It was a decade of research and writing, involved a decade of research and writing. I had clinical experience with victims and offenders in multiple ways. I had a 360-degree perspective on the topic because I was involved with all folk involved, from legal systems to victims, their families, perpetrators, their families, bishops, the Vatican, the whole lot. My research was both local and global, and it took individual and systemic perspectives. Now I'm struggling to, okay, so just to move the slide on. So two issues for me were always getting conflated in the public discourse, and that was the genesis of the problem. Like, what is it all about? What caused it? Journalists were always asking, what is this about? What caused it? But also the response to the problem, the bishops and how they responded, and the Vatican and how they responded. And the two were always getting mixed up in somehow. In public discourse. So I decided that I wanted to really try and get to what is it all about, first of all, and then what was the response all about? And so in terms of the genesis of the problem, many of you are familiar with these ideas, but mostly when people were thinking, what's this all about? What caused it? They went to the individual, to the clergy perpetrators, and they said, there must be something wrong with him. How could, a priest abuse a child? There must be something in his psychology. There must be something in his history. He's either evil or mad or bad or something. But when I got stuck into an analysis of the individual factors, without condoning or without making excuses for, yes, indeed, there were individual factors, but there were also systemic factors that were in play in the genesis of this problem. So the individual factors were arranged there, and I won't go through them all, but just hit at some of them. The confiding space, use of confession to overcome moral conscience by individual clergy. That was quite important. Power and opportunity, a sense of entitlement, or also a sense that they were not doing harm to the child because the child didn't really know what was happening. These were all part of the individual thinking patterns, sexuality issues, emotional loneliness, obedience and overt conformity. Many of the men that I both was engaged in my research and over the years, but also in treatment programs for these men, were overtly compliant and conformist. But meanwhile, underneath the radar, there was a lot of anger simmering at the system or at the life. So having thought about and talked about and done research on and with the individual factors, I was left really thinking, but that's not the whole story. There are bigger factors in play here. And how I knew that was because I had in-depth engagement and involvement with the religious orders, leaders of religious orders, and with the bishops. Not only in Ireland, but in many other countries, including the United States and Canada and Australia. So when I started to investigate the systemic factors, these are the factors that came to be meaningful from my perspective. Catholic moral teaching was huge, is huge in a lot of the abuses that happens within that organization, because it led to problems in sexuality. And when you combine that then with some of the issues that priests had in living the priesthood, combined with sexuality issues based on moral teaching, Catholic moral teaching, that was a problem. The structure of governance, the ecclesiastical structure of governance, relations and hierarchical authority also was part of the problem. There was a lack of accountability. Canon law was in play, how that made for various actions couldn't be investigated and so on. Clerical culture, clericalism, all of you know about clericalism, I've no doubt. And most importantly, I also found that seminaries and the systems of formation that were in play at the time, and there have been some modifications in these over years, but that also was very important as part of the systemic context of this problem. And then if you look to the response to the problem, I analysed for that research, and since then, many reports, inquiries, commissions of inquiry, reports, and everything else to do with the response to the problem. And what I can tell you categorically is there was awareness of the abuse problem prior to within the Catholic Church, prior to the crisis of the 1990s. This problem has been known to the hierarchies for many years. To a greater or lesser extent, let's say. We know of the traumatic impact on children. Whilst the clergy offenders and some bishops argued we didn't think it was hurting the children, we didn't know that it was having such a devastating impact. Well, we well know now the impact on children. We know from all of these responses, in the response at the time to the problem, this is in the 2000s, it has changed a little since then in some jurisdictions. Certainly in Ireland it has changed a little, and we can go through these, but in other jurisdictions it hasn't changed at all. But this factor, there were poor communications with victims following abuse complaints, failure to report abuse complaints to the civil authorities. That has now changed in Ireland. All abuse complaints are reported to the civil authorities. The police said to me, "Oh my God, would you please tell the clergy, the religious leaders, stop reporting dead men to us?" Because they took this so seriously after all the reports, and they were so worn out, I suppose, and so brutalized by what happened in Ireland, that the religious authorities were reporting dead men when they had complaints about them. The police were saying, "We can't investigate dead men, sorry." The approach to clergy offenders has changed over time. We know this from all the reports. They used to move them around. They sometimes sent them to treatment. They sometimes sent them to confession. They often didn't give the reports from the full report of the extent of what they knew from the files to the treatment providers. That has all changed now. Claims for compensation were settled on condition of confidentiality, and to some extent that still happens even when claims are settled. This confidentiality thing, our state had a gagging order on victims following the Ryan report and the redress of children who were abused in the institutions, that our state had a gagging order and still has a gagging order on those victims who were awarded monetary compensation but were not allowed to speak of their experience. The religious orders and the diocese often put forward legal defense of the allegations, but again, that has changed. And I think even although there's robust, what I'd call legal posturing, which makes it difficult for survivors or for victims, in the end, I think that the church tend to settle these cases. And we know from all the reports that there was sexual abuse in the seminaries. So the explanations by the bishops and religious orders for their response was, well, we were on a learning curve. They blamed canon law. We were restricted and constricted by canon law. Various popes had different views on this, and we couldn't get full attention from the Vatican or the popes to the thing. A culture of obedience. When you're ordained, or I think that's the term, a bishop, you know, you have this obedience, as do many of the priests. And that culture of obedience that I found with the clergy offenders was also there in the bishops. They didn't want to upset. And then they also had this bad apple theory. Look at your, God knows, whatever we were doing, these bad apples were all infiltrating the clergy, and they were becoming priests in order to gain access to children to abuse them. That was not my findings in my research. Rather, that was the exception. I often thought that it's a long way to go to gain access to children to abuse by going 7 years into a seminary. Joining the Boy Scouts or some of these other organizations was an easier route. So whilst that certainly is the case in a minority of cases, I actually think that the majority of clergy offenders became clergy offenders within the context of the organizational culture of the Catholic Church. Now, have I missed anything there? Oh, let me just go back. So now I want to, I'm hitting the thing here and it just is moving on. Now I want to talk about, so that's the story really of where I thought came from and came to, and some of the thoughts I had on the matter. But I want to talk about power. And when I was trying to analyze, and still am at different levels of engagement, trying to analyze from a power perspective what this was all about, I had to draw on multiple ways, multiple perspectives on power. No one power theoretical formulation would help, or was sufficient from my perspective. So power's domination, the feminist perspective, I saw that in place. I saw domination, power over, top-down, gendered power views in play. I saw all of that. So the feminist perspective helped me to some extent, but not all the way. It just helped some of the way. So Stephen Luke's work on power as relational was also very helpful, which is power as complex and shifting. That was very helpful also because of the dynamics that I was seeing in play in these organizations. And then Foucault's idea of power as omnipresent, that regulates and constrains and makes possible opportunities and also offers constraints, that was also helpful in trying to theorize this problem. Oops. And what I found that might be helpful to some of you who are thinking about this problem is that in relation to the clergy offenders, and I pulled this quote from the book, it wasn't power per se, or it wasn't powerlessness vis-a-vis those in authority per se that was part of the problem. It was the interplay of power and powerlessness. So I believed that these men, or I found, lived out of an unreflective script of a sense of private powerlessness vis-a-vis the life, the hierarchy, the bishops, the religious orders, etc. Whilst within that private sense of powerlessness, they were ministering in a site of unsupervised and unchallenged public dominance by virtue of all the other factors I mentioned to you, clericalism and so on. And this paradox is at the core of the abuse crisis of both the clergy and the handling of the issue. So a feeling of private powerlessness eclipsed an awareness of the power context in which and from which they ministered and they operated. So any of you who are involved in education will be starting to think, well, of course, if this is at the core of this, then you have to look at the seminaries and how we train these, because it's not sufficient. Anybody who's a psychotherapist will know it doesn't matter if I feel weak today or in powerless in my personal life. If I'm in the context of a therapeutic relationship with someone, I'm in the power position, or I have to at least acknowledge the power context I'm in. And these men weren't doing that. So I believe that it's the paradox of power and powerlessness that's at the heart of the abuse issue for the Roman Catholic clergy. And therefore, the picture of power relations is a complex one. It's not just that they were in a power position. It's more complex than that. So they were both powerful and powerless. And that is the constellation rather than the power position per se that I saw as contributing to the problem. Now, I mentioned that in the public discourse, there was a conflation of the genesis of the issue of the problem and the response to the problem, and that it was getting woolly and mixed up. And so that's why I separated them and investigated them and continue to investigate them in more and more disclosures of different aspects of the problem that emerge. Doris was telling me about her research. So, you know, it's still worth keeping this distinction in mind, the genesis of the problem and the response. But then I came back to seeing, is there a relationship between the genesis of the problem, i.e. the clergy offenders, and the bishops and religious leaders who were responding? Is there something that is there a relationship between this? And there's lots of things that brought it. But I believe that the sexual abuse of children in the private realm, i.e. in children's homes or in the children's family home or in the course of ministering or whatever, that the sexual abuse of children in the private realm functioned to preserve the priesthood in the public sphere, with the kind of with the image that priesthood had as perfect priest, as long as the secret could be maintained. And once that blew, then now we're into more complex territory. But I concluded that the conditions that gave rise to the abuse of children, some of the systemic conditions to the abuse of children and vulnerable adults by clergy, were also many of the factors that contributed to the manner in which the leaders of the church responded. So back to some of those factors that I scanned through: clericalism, power, over various other theology of church, theology of sexuality, so on. And I believe that if we really want to say that the church has truly changed in relation to, they've learned the lessons and they want to respond and have learned, anyone who wants to do that, I think you could take my book and develop a set of indicators and go through every single factor and see how they've done on the various factors. Because just developing procedures, although they're better to respond to the problem. Now we'll report to the civil authorities. That's helpful. But without tackling the issues that are at the genesis of the problem, God knows what other problems will be emerging from this organization. So I want to just offer you a thought about a three-way analysis of the problem. And in a way, three contributors to the problem, if you like. And I'd feel it would be remiss of me not to mention this. And so we have the actual offenders. They were the ones who did, so to speak, the bruises or the invisible bruises. But the responders to the disclosure, the bishops, the church leaders, and the state, who didn't respond and still don't respond in many instances adequately. But there's also the community and the society. And in the Irish situation, we certainly had a kind of a continuum of knowing. So some people knew a lot in the society and closed a blind eye. Some people knew very little. And Derek Scally, who works there, Irish Times journalist, Berlin correspondent, has tried to, in his book, to have a go at trying to understand this. Why did communities, why did society, why did you and I, who knew to a greater or lesser extent, why did we turn away? And to some extent, why do we still turn away? So how I came then to thinking about organized irresponsibility, and some of you will have seen, when you've read the book, that there are 2 chapters that I start by calling them organized irresponsibility, both individual stuff and systemic stuff. But this is based on the work of Beck, that wonderful sociologist. And basically, I'm sure you're all, this audience is well aware of what organized irresponsibility means following Beck. But I kind of adapted it, and it came in very helpful theoretically and conceptually, because it was like where individuals cumulative, and I adapted it, if you like. I still call it organized irresponsibility because it's the best description. But where individuals, so the actual offenders, the bishops, the Vatican, the whole hierarchy, and then Irish society, let's say, or international society, cumulatively contribute to the risks, but we avoid culpability. And this way of thinking can enable a process where actors, either individuals or large organizations, can produce risk. And I argue that this is what happens in the Catholic Church by the way it's organized, by the way it's governed, by the way the theology of sexuality, all of those issues I've mentioned as we took the journey. But they can also avoid the consequences of those risks, or the consequences that would follow for our part in contributing to those risks. And Derek Scally has tried to look at what this might mean, thinking of the Holocaust and following some of the ways that people have taken individual responsibility for being a bystander or whatever. So in a way, I see the Catholic Church as having become a laboratory for abuse. But nobody really, apart from the individual perpetrator who did the bruises, so to speak, the visible and invisible bruises, and the odd bishop who failed to act occasionally, have been in any way become accountable. And I think that part of that is that we haven't theorized sufficiently ways of taking group responsibility or moral responsibility from a a group perspective, and that we still default to individualistic models of responsibility. It was him or it was her. So that takes me to responsibility. And, you know, we can say, if we wanted to, well, let's say we've had this in Ireland, people who delivered food to the industrial schools, bakers and local people, who kind of didn't fully know what was going on, but they knew kids were running away from it and kids were saying that they were hurt and abused and so on. So we've had like the bakers and the local bankers and people saying, but it wasn't really my responsibility, I wasn't sure, or whatever. Then we've had people saying, well, I was like the cog in the wheel. I knew, I've had a priest, multiple, tell me, I knew that priest was bringing children up to his bedroom, but it wasn't really up to me to say anything because I had to look after my own bit and and then you have the cog in the wheel. I've had it recently with where there have been a false allegation where abuses took place, this time towards the priest by the religious. And when I've done the investigation into that, they've said, but I knew I was perpetrating injustice by naming him publicly and this, that, and the other, but I was effectively a cog in a wheel. I was constrained by all these policies now that I have to act within. So the cog in the wheel morality doesn't cut it really with me in any direction, and I'm sure it doesn't cut it with you. But it's easy to rationalize, well, I trust they know better or it's not my business. But moral responsibility really requires that we all, irrespective of what position we're in the organization, that we assume responsibility for our actions. So the more I was hearing about all this, the more I found myself coming to and continue to come to Hannah Arendt and her work on responsibility and judgment. And to summarize, she said, irrespective, and this is following the Eichmann trials, irrespective of your position in the organization, you are obligated in moral conscience. If you see wrongdoing, you have to call it out. Now, I have to tell you, I have longer than I want really experience of the Catholic Church in dealing with this issue. But in higher education, in universities at the moment, we are also finding problems of sexual violence and harassment, and calling it out that we're obligated to do is quite difficult. It involves a lot of courage and it involves some cost. But I learned through all of this, that I learned it a long time ago in my personal life, that we need to put ourselves in the place of the other. And only then can we start doing our rationalizations and so on. We put ourselves into position with a child and we then say, of course we have to act. Or we put ourselves in the place of the colleague who's been sexually harassed and abused and bullied. Of course we have to act, irrespective of the consequences for my professional promotion and all the rest of it. So following Arendt back to the clergy, she beautifully illustrated that a moral education, I brought Arendt and all I knew about the Catholic Church into relationship and to the moral education that these priests had. Degrees in moral theology, 7 years in many cases in a seminary, philosophy till they're blue in the face. And I'm thinking, how could they do all that moral theology and still not know what was the right thing to do, or still overrule their conscience? And of course, Arendt produces the answer. A moral education that is overly intellectualized and technical and focuses primarily on abstract problems, or a rule book morality. That's what clergy had. They had the rule book morality, but they didn't integrate it. They weren't helped integrate it by the silence and the secrecies that prevailed in the religious orders and in the seminaries at the time. And people have told me that if they were struggling with sexuality, if they thought they were gay, they daren't in their 7 years discuss this. That's changed a bit. There's a lot of change in some states. In the United States, there's minor changes in others. Sometimes people are asked to leave if you disclose you're gay. But that is just a recipe for disaster, because it's it's getting people into the mindset of secrecy. And one of the men that I both worked with and followed up over many years told me that he first abused children the day of his ordination, and that he had been waiting for many years, thinking that when he was free and ordained, not that he would abuse children, but that he would have relationships. But his first, in his mind, relationship was with a minor. So that's a quick whistle tour through some of the concepts, so a little bit of the story and some of the concepts that have been quite helpful to me and continue to be helpful in thinking my way through this. And many of you are familiar with, we've had in Ireland Magdalene laundries, we have lots of report after report after report on the abuses that women and their babies and their unborn babies and their live babies have suffered with the interface of church and state in Ireland. And all of these concepts continue to be helpful. But I suppose I wanted to end with, I've come to start to rethink also justice. And many of you will know that for the last 10 years, I've been researching restorative justice and asking, has this anything to offer us here? Because victims were getting no justice through criminal justice. They were getting a modicum of compensation through civil justice, and they were really not getting very far in getting the truth. So I've been analysing this, but just to say that restorative justice defines justice not the Roman way as right, rules and intention and process, but restorative justice defines justice as the Hebrew way, as right relationship measured by outcome. So I'm really interested all the time in, I'm not that keen on talk. I'm very interested in truth telling, so that's talk, but I'm very keen on measuring justice by the outcome. So I hope that's been helpful to you to just give a sense of some of what I've been thinking about over the years. Thank you.